Welcome to Modern Farm Business Podcast. This podcast is designed to help the farm leader bring their business to the next level. We'll cover everything from leadership and finance to strategy and planning. I'm your host, Dean Hefta. Sometimes in business, we find ourselves getting into a certain situation and thinking, I sure wish I would have thought this through a little differently. Often those situations have to do with people involved in the farm or our business. We set up maybe a certain compensation or a benefit or a perk for a person. It could be our nephew or our brother, a neighbor, or maybe a supplier relationship. And suddenly that event becomes a permanent expectation. Then we feel stuck. We regret setting the expectation, and now we're not sure what to do next to address it so we can move into the future. To share some insights with us today, I'm joined by Larry Custer, account manager with Water Street Solutions. Larry brings experience not only from working with farmer clients throughout the Midwest in their farm businesses, but also having been a business owner himself, a retail district manager, as well as many years in the Army. Larry, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Dean.
You've seen all kinds of farm business situations. You've helped people work through them. And one of the areas I'd like to start wrestling with is, let's start with the difference between being paid for our work on the farm versus being paid as an owner. Tell us how and when and some of the things that you encounter with this.
Yeah, we see that confusion a lot on the farm. I think compensation in general is a really difficult thing for most folks to get their heads wrapped around. But just to distinguish the two, I think maybe the best example is, owning shares in a publicly traded company, owning some stock. Most of us that own stock in a company or in a portfolio somewhere certainly don't work in that company. I'm thinking of Walmart, for example. I own some Walmart shares, but I certainly don't work in the company. I don't run the company. I don't think in my lifetime I'll ever run the company. So that's an example where, hey, that's really easy to get. It's purely an investment. It's purely investment dollars that pay me back. There's no wage, if you will, or form of compensation because I don't work there. And on the farm, it's a little different because the ownership happens so much more closely. It's a closely held business rather than a publicly traded company. And sometimes it gets pretty confusing. Am I getting paid a wage or should I be paid something for the investment on the farm itself?
So when I think about that, say I'm owner of the farm or I'm an owner of a small business, before I get myself into a spot where there's kind of this confusion, maybe between ownership, could be with myself, maybe I'm confusing things, maybe I've got partners. What are some principles or best practices that we would want to have in play as we think about compensation and the difference between rewarding people for their effort versus rewarding people for ownership?
That's a great question, Dean. I think probably starting with compensation helps the most. If I look at, let's just take about any company in the world out there, almost all of them are not going to pay the janitor the way they pay the CEO. And so I'm using an extreme example there, the bottom of the chain versus top of the chain to understand. But then in between, there's hundreds and hundreds of jobs that are paid just right for what they're contributing to the business. And so often I think in family businesses, and farms are no different, it's a temptation because they're all my children or they're my nephew or they're a relation, or I really like this person, that we are tempted to pay them all the same regardless of their contribution. And I've seen this many times in family businesses where you have one child who's really, really engaged and, probably works there on average between 60 and 80 hours a week to do the farm business. And another child who's not expected to do those things, but maybe helps out with planting or fall, and yet they're paid the same way. And that just wouldn't seem right to the rest of the world. So the challenge there is, hey, how can I know that I am compensating people fairly? And that can be its own set of challenges, but something that can be worked through and understood. But most likely, if you're paying everyone equally, it's probably not right. It's probably not the best setup.
What about the flip side of it? Maybe I've got a brother who is a part owner in the farm business, and the history has been, I'm taking basically a wage out of the farm, even though he's not really involved in the day-to-day activity. What are some of the dynamics about that side of it?
Also a good question. How I would choose to lead people to a different thinking about that is I probably wouldn't call that a wage. If that's a silent partner, as we might call it in town, meaning someone who doesn't have a role on the farm, they're not actually working in it. Maybe they own it with me half and half as my brother, but others are doing all the work. Then what we'd want to do to help make that fair is pay the working partner a wage, whether it's something hourly or a salary or some sort of share of what they're doing. That would only go to the efforts they're putting in. Then what's left over, also known as the profits or losses there, what's left over, now we're going to split according to our ownership. And that's the best way to compensate in any sort of partnership or business structure where you have some individuals that also own, also working in the business. The best way is to compensate them for their work. And then what's left over, that's split based on the profits of the organization.
When you look at, it could be a nonprofit organization that has bylaws. Maybe it's a business that has operating agreements. What are some of the lessons or principles from that for a sole proprietor, informal partnership, things like that would be wise for us to use as principles or work through before we get too far down this path?
Yeah, that's a great point too. You bring up sole proprietorship and operating agreements kind of in the same breath there, but sole proprietorships are becoming rarer and rarer and probably should be, especially in farming. And the reason why is our farm asset bases have gotten so valuable, whether it's, almost all acres are $10,000 or more now. Equipment lines, oh my golly, some of the, $3 to $5 million equipment lines and higher on up. Reason we don't want sole proprietorships is that really opens you up to all kinds of personal liability, when really you should be separating some of that into business liability. Protect your personal assets. So things like land and things like equipment, those might be better off from a liability perspective in something that limits liability. So some type of corporation or a limited liability company, something like that you could talk to with your attorney, but you're probably far better off in the long run to not be a sole proprietorship anymore. To your point though, if it's a partnership or a company where there's going to be multiple owners, it's much like a prenuptial agreement. And I'm not supporting prenuptials. I'm just saying it's probably too late to have a prenuptial after the divorce has been filed. So it's getting ahead of these business things that we know will come up in business. So how will assets be divided if we separate this? How are we going to make decisions? Is it a vote? Does everyone's vote count the same? What about my wife? Does she have a vote? Does your wife have a vote? What about hiring people? Can I hire my children but not yours? These are just some of the basic questions that we might address in operating agreements so that it doesn't cause stress or drama or problems when the business demands we answer these questions. And so there's lots and lots of other examples. I just picked some of the ones to name a few that often come up, but it can be really healthy to set out how we're going to make decisions and how we're going to divide profits, if at all, well before we get to the time where it's time to divvy up. It just seems to make things go really well, and sometimes helps us maybe not get in a partnership that based on assumptions where we thought somebody was on the same page or like-minded as I am. Instead, we get to find out the differences ahead of time and then decide more consciously how we want to approach the business challenge.
Well, that makes sense. And it got me thinking that even, so you're going to do that hopefully well, not necessarily, but hopefully at the front of your mind with a formal arrangement like an LLC or LLP or something like that. But those are good practices even on, casual agreements. Could be something that we're doing with a neighbor or with somebody like that isn't a corporate structure. Would you say that's a good practice just in general? How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to approach disagreements?
Absolutely. And the reason why is usually once we're in a disagreement, whether it's I failed to set expectations for what I was thinking, or we did set expectations and I think you've fallen short of those. whatever has led to the conflict, without having predefined or having a good way of getting out of conflict together, chances are we won't. And whatever level of relationship we had before will somehow be diminished, whether it's just a nick of less trust that I have in you, or in other cases, family members too. We've all heard or experienced the families that have had these long periods of separation where I didn't talk to them for 20 years. No one wants that for anyone they're in business with, in particularly a family member. So being able to come up with how we're going to resolve issues, because we are going to have them, and how we're going to set expectations and who's responsible for what in the business ahead of time can be so healthy. And you're right, Dean, it matters in other relationships too. The more specific I can be in terms of how we're going about doing whatever we're doing together, the more likely I am to not be disappointed. It's usually when I've miscommunicated something myself or assumed something of some other person. That's usually when I find myself tempted to be disappointed. And so unless I really work on that, I'll find myself in distress much more often than the average folk. So the better people are at accepting and setting expectations around us, the more likely we are to get what we expect.
Larry, you touched a little bit on this earlier, but let's dive into this next generation coming in. Maybe I've got a son or a nephew or a cousin, somebody coming in, maybe they're 20 or 25 or 30 years old. And there's a lot of dynamics and expectations that can happen. When there's relations, I'm related to somebody, it just adds some complexity to it. What are some things that I would want to keep in mind in bringing that next generation in right? And I know there's not a perfect way, and every situation is a little different, but what are some things that I should maybe think about as principles?
Well, I think a big one is really recognizing, do I have someone that works with me, or do I have really what is a successor? And so when I think of a successor, it's someone that's qualified to do more than the technical work of the operation. So often when we have a younger family member come in, and I still think this is a healthy way to start them. We have them scoop poop. We have them do the chores. We have them do these things that really aren't much about running the farm at all. They're more about the tasks on the farm and getting the chores done and the day-to-day stuff. And that's all healthy. I think all young producers should go through that. And then as old producers, we should probably go through that again so that we let the young ones start to begin to take over the business. So when I'm talking about those skills that are running the business, I'm talking about sitting through tax meetings. Should I sell grain here? How are we logistically going to handle this new landlord that's really out of our territory, but we sure could use the acres because we might lose some? These bigger questions that drive the business side of the farm. Being able to have someone that's going to enjoy that work, that's going to really ingrain themselves in that type of work and really try to get better in each of the areas the farm's demands, that's all goes towards qualified successor. So oftentimes when I first sit down with families and farm owners, their primary thinking is who's going to get what, or what kind of taxes is going to create, rather than, hey, we want to put together a plan, maybe some passages that the younger generation has to go through, so that when they actually sit in my seat, they're better qualified than I was to be able to handle what agriculture is going to throw at it in their career. And so there's a real difference between inheriting something and being a successor to something, in my mind.
That helps. What are some things that I should make sure not to do? Let's say my son's coming in, he's 23 years old. What shouldn't I do? Or what should I be aware of if I choose to do it? There could be some consequences down the road.
Honestly, by 23, chances are we'll know, anyone from the outside, if you've done a good job as a parent or not by 23. A lot of the what to do and not to do, you've already set the precedent for well before that. Usually in childhood and even as young teenagers, most of those value sets are there. But if you're a couple of things that get a little bit confusing as someone comes of age or gets back from college, really starts working, I'd go back to this compensation thing, making sure everyone's on the same page for what the duties are performed, having real world evidence for here's how we're going to pay, and making sense of that pay for everybody. So, for example, not just, hey, how much is your paycheck and at what periods of time can you expect it, but some of these other non-cash compensations that the farm so often has, whether that be access to a pickup truck, maybe it's fuel, maybe it's health care, maybe you actually board from the farm because of we bought an 80 a couple years back and it had a nice house on it. You might as well live there. We're not going to charge you rent. So separating the cash part of compensation as well as those non-cash compensations to form what we would call in the business world total compensation can really be helpful. That way, if someone ever moves out of that house or we sell that house or something changes, I don't want to perform these duties anymore, then we can continue to make changes as responsibilities change, as things on the farm change, as really year-to-year changes, right, financially and what's happening with the farm. So just to keep everyone on the same page, review those things, early and often, and just keeping on track of having a good compensation plan are some of the things. We can ruin people by, most often people think of undercompensating someone, indentured servitude, and we certainly run into that less and less often nowadays, but there still are those issues. But more importantly, that we don't overpay them either. Why would I ever want to take over the farm if the most I'm ever going to make is in my 20s? And we've seen some young farmers really have a really hard time adjusting from overcompensating, just as easily damaging as undercompensating. So compensating just right.
Great insights, Larry. I appreciate you sharing that. Joining me today has been Larry Custer. He's account manager with Water Street Solutions, and he works with farmers throughout the U.S., helping them with the business side of the farm. And appreciate you sharing your experience and your perspective,
Well, Dean, thanks
Larry.
so much for having me today.
And thank all of you for joining me on this episode with Larry. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email at dean@modernfarmbusiness.com, and I'll look forward to visiting with you again next week.